Well, I'm struggling to find where to start from. But let me start on a very personal note. And that is to express a very special gratitude to His Excellency John Dramani Mahama. He accepted to write the foreword to my book and personally launched the book. As we speak, the book has gained 5-star status on Amazon. In fact, 4 universities in Africa have decided that it is a compulsory reading material. And I don't think that it is just because of what I wrote. His own intellectual input has helped to propel this book to the levels it has reached. And I must express my very deep gratitude to President John Dramani Mahama for being a part of this work. You know, I've been looking for an opportunity to say this publicly. You understand? Not just that, as a result of this work that I did, with his inputs. Since then, I've been to every Heads of State Summit of the AU. I've been to so many events around the world, and I've been offered positions again in 4 universities in Africa as you know, visiting lecturer and so on, you know. So I'm very grateful to him. And this has nothing to do with his presidency of Ghana or whatever. This is just somebody who agreed to give weight, to put a lot of weight on some work that I had done. So I'm grateful to President John Dramani Mahama. Now to the issues. And the first thing to say, the first most important thing to say, is that no amount of money can compensate for the crimes which have been committed against the African people. First, through the transatlantic slave trade, classical colonialism, and today's neocolonialism, no amount of money can pay for the damage which was done, for the atrocities which were committed, for the crimes against us. No amount of money can pay for that. So when we talk about reparation, we are not talking about the payment of money, and we are not talking about assistance from the perpetrators. What we are talking about is resetting the world. And everybody must understand that very clearly. And that's why I made the point that it doesn't appear that Solo has grasped the full gravity of what we are discussing. Reparation, as is politically and socially defined today, is resetting the world, not collecting money and not demanding assistance. The whole world needs to be reset so that the dignity of the African is restored, not by the perpetrators, but by the African himself and by institutions that we have collectively established after World War II. That's the point of reparation. You see, today, on this continent, well, in the world, today, there are 1.4 billion Africans. 1.4 billion Africans. Far bigger population than the United States of America. Far bigger population than Germany, than Britain, than France, than all of them. 1.4 billion Africans. And we have no say in anything. You go to the United Nations, we are only allowed to vote in the UN General Assembly, and the votes in the UN General Assembly don't count. We have no veto in the UN Security Council. Why? Suhini, why? It is because At the time the UN was being established and its agencies, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, we were not at the table. We were then colonies. We had no votes. We had no voice. So they built supposedly global institutions to exclude us. That must change. That is part of reparation. The restructuring of the UN, the restructuring of the WTO, the restructuring of the IMF and the World Bank is reparation. So to think that reparation is about assistance and money is to miss the point. Because the whole world needs restructuring. You understand? And I can go on and on and on. Now, Suhini, oh, sorry. Again. Suhini, you always confuse me. Why do you do that to me all the time? Sana? Even when you are not here mentioning your name, what's wrong? But Sana, listen very carefully. Listen very carefully. The legal justification for slavery and by extension for colonialism was provided for by the Catholic Church. And the legal justification assumed or presumed African inferiority. It is captured in the papal bull issued by the Pope in 1452 to King Alfonso of Portugal. Read it, Google it, read it. The papal bull. It authorized King Alfonso to come to our part of the world to civilize us. So it already assumed superiority for the enslaver. It already assumed superiority for the European. They came to civilize us. And by civilization, they meant accepting Christianity. And the papal bull of 1452 actually ordered King Alfonso to kill us if we resisted Christianity. Kill us. To seize our properties, take us into slavery, and take over our wives if we resisted Christianity. This is the crime which was committed against us. So he talks about a conservative estimate of 12.6 million people who were taken into slavery. But do the maths. The estimate also says that 3 times that number or more were killed in order to get the 12.6 million. To be able to get 12.6 million slaves to go and sell, they killed 3 times that number in the wars of enslavement. Just imagine. You understand? Now, it doesn't end there. The transatlantic slave trade and colonialism destroyed our science. Today, our science is at this level because of what they did to us. And I was talking about a story which President John Dramani Mahama told. He told 2 stories. I don't know which one he was referring to. The story of the African woman from Elimina, whose only crime was that she had used an African balm prepared by African herbalists to cure a scratch on her hand. She was captured, tried in the castle, subsequently taken to Portugal to be tried again for witchcraft. So if you use African medicine, it was described as witchcraft, for which you could be convicted. Is this not a destruction of African science? That's one story. The other story is of a South African woman. When they came here, they saw the bodies of our women. And they thought that the bodies of our women were much more different from the bodies of their wives and children and so on. Because our women were endowed in the rear. They had interesting backsides. Okay? So they captured this South African woman, put her in a glass cage, and exhibited her across Europe. They hadn't seen that kind of a woman before, with that kind of endowment, beautiful endowment, you know, and so on. They put her in a cage and exhibited her. The woman was so maltreated that then she committed suicide. She committed suicide. You see, if you look at the 12.6 million people who were taken out of our continent, they didn't take the sick. They didn't take old men and women. They didn't take illiterates. They didn't take imbeciles. They took the best of our population. Our architects, our doctors, our engineers, our rulers, and so on. That's what they took to Europe. You understand? To the extent that the development of science in Europe benefited tremendously from the stealing of African science. And I'll give you one example. I didn't know until recently, when COVID-19 broke out, and there was this discussion about vaccines and the efficacy of vaccines and so on. It turned out that vaccine was introduced in the United States of America by an African slave from West Africa. This whole thing about vaccine was developed in West Africa, and it got transported to the United States of America. Today, how many African countries are producing vaccines? They killed that technology. You understand? Which is vital for the survival of humankind. It came from here. Nobody has paid one penny, $1 for that technology which is African. Nobody. So when he spoke about something, African artifacts on displays in museums and so on. Yes, what he said is true, but it's more than that. Today, if you visit the museums in the so-called civilized countries, Britain, Germany, France, and so on, there are some items on display that we don't talk about. Those items are the heads of our heroes. Those who resisted them, those who resisted the slavery, those who resisted colonial were killed. They were beheaded, and their heads were taken to their capitals for display. What kind of civilization displays human heads? What kind of civilization displays human heads and so on? I mean, Mujib was talking about, oh, maybe they shouldn't pay us money and so on. What we need scholarships to study. To study what?
Somebody said that message.
Those scholarships are largely responsible for our underdevelopment today. And I'll explain. You see, we are constantly being taught by them that if we want to develop, we should adopt their models of development. That's what they teach us all the time. All your professors and so on who end up in Harvard, who end up in Oxford and so on. Why? They mess up with their brains. They teach them that the only way for Africa to develop is to adopt their models of development. What is their model of development? Their model of development is based on slavery and colonial exploitation. Britain could not have become what it is today if it hadn't been for slave labor and the stealing of African resources. Okay? So how do you adopt the British model of development? Who are you going to capture as slaves to come and work for you for hundreds of years without pay if you are going to adopt the British model of development? Which countries in the world are you going to colonize to be able to steal their resources for your benefit? That option of development is not available to us. So our education must change. We need a new education which rejects those models of development, because those models of development are impossible for us. We need to change. Okay? So if you want classes to go and study those kind of rubbish, those models of development, we ain't going nowhere. You understand? We are stuck here. Yes, it is true. There are horrible African heads of states. Really horrible. African heads of states who have betrayed us, who continue to betray us. I still cannot believe that Cote d'Ivoire, after independence, its first president was a citizen of France. Once he was still president of La Cote d'Ivoire, he was a citizen of France. Not just that, he was a member of the French Parliament. The president of La Cote d'Ivoire was a member of the French Parliament. What rubbish is that? But that was a reality. So you are right. Some of our leaders have betrayed us. Those of our leaders who conspired with the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America to overthrow Nkrumah are some of those who betrayed us, who betrayed our interests, who continued the work of the slave traders, and so on. You understand? I agree with you to that extent. But the conduct of those leaders does not in any way invalidate the demand for reparation. Because why? Listen, there is no institution in the West which is doing well, which is not a beneficiary of the exploitation of the African people. No institution in the world. You see, I like to talk about Barclays Bank, one of the huge financial institutions of the West and so on. What is the origin of the wealth of Barclays Bank and its survival until today? Barclays Bank was established by two brothers known as the Barclay brothers. Do you know how they accumulated the surpluses which led to the establishment of Barclays Bank? They were slave traders. The Barclay brothers were slave traders. Barclays Bank was established with slave resources. So today, we as Africans are entitled to that wealth, which is Barclays Bank. We're entitled to it. Our forebears worked without pay in order to create Barclays Bank. What other institution can you mention which is not a direct beneficiary of our exploitation and of our enslavement and so on? Yes, you're right. When you go to the Western embassies and you see long queues of people struggling to go there and so on, it is the result of slavery. It is the result of colonialism and so on. But it is in no way the equivalent of slavery. It cannot be. They killed our people. They shot them in the Congo. Do you know what happened in the Congo? The Congo was the personal property of King Leopold of Belgium. The Congo was an exception. It was a personal property of King Leopold. The whole of Congo was seen as a rubber plantation. That is how King Leopold made his money, from rubber. So the Congolese people were required to supply a certain quantity of rubber within a certain period. If you fail to provide that quantity of rubber, they amputated one hand. Amputated one hand for not supplying the quantity of rubber that King Leopold wanted. If you repeated the crime a second time and the crime was not supplying enough rubber for King Leopold, they cut off the other hand. Amputation. Amputation. Look at what they did in Kenya to the Mahama movement. The slaughter. The concentration camp that they built, like a Nazi concentration camp in Kenya. How they fought. And I've had the privilege of speaking to Field Marshal Matumba, a woman general of the Mahama movement, and her story would make you cry. What they did to them, the torture, the atrocities and so on. Put that aside. Today in Ghana, we are still grappling with the Boku and other chieftaincy crisis. What is the origin? The origin of those crises can be found in the so-called theory and practice of indirect rule. And they credit Lord Lugard, who was the governor in Nigeria, as it's not true. If you read the proper historical account, if you read Dr. Don Atta's book, and with evidence and so on, you find that it was not Lord Lugard who came up with the idea of indirect rule. Indeed, it was his girlfriend, who was a journalist, who came up with the idea, but it's credited to Lord Lugard. That's another matter, you understand? But the point is that when they came here, some of our communities did not have chiefs. But they decided to rule through chiefs. So they decided to create chiefs and to impose chiefs on the communities by force. So, for example, in the Ga areas, there were no chiefs. The Gas were led by Wulomere, not chiefs. But they created paramountcies and so on. So is it that in Boku, there were Tindanas or Tindanis, whatever. And they created paramountcies. And we have continued to suffer as a result of these impositions on us. You understand? We continue to suffer as a result of these impositions on us. Well, still, the crime continues up to today. And I'm so happy about the text message which was sent by Azuma Besori, inviting all of us on Tuesday to join the observance of the Day of Shame. And I will be there. And I will urge every citizen who can to be there at the Day of Shame, to listen to the argument, to confront the material, and so on. Because it's important to expose these. Why? Today, as we sit here, some of our friends, from the Dankwa Buzia tradition and so on, are justifying the 1966 coup. It makes me feel like puking. How can you justify the 1966 coup? You can only do that if you are ignorant, if you don't know the facts. September 21, 1961, the British High Commissioner in Ghana, A.W. Snelling, sent a cable to his own government, asking them to speed up the overthrow of Nkrumah because he was making the African too politically conscious. The document is still there. It's in the declassified documents. It's in the book titled The Great Deception, How the CIA Overthrew Nkrumah. All these documents are available. If you don't read, it's your headache. But if you can't read, don't join the public discussion with your half-baked truths and lies. The British were clear that Nkrumah had to be overthrown because he was making the African politically too conscious. It's in the cable which was written by A.W. Snelling and sent to his home government. Don't tell us those cock and bull stories anymore. You understand? That was why Nkrumah was overthrown. The overthrow of Nkrumah has not just led to national regression. It has led to a near collapse of the African dream. The African dream of maintaining sovereignty, of building a new world in which the African will be respected. You understand? Now, listen. Do you know the extent to which they went? They blame Nkrumah for instituting a one-party state. What did they do after the 1966 coup? They banned political parties so that they can win elections and stay in power. What's the difference between that and a one-party state? Banning your opponents and declaring a one-party state. What's the difference? Tell me what the difference is. They complain about the Preventive Detention Act, but they brought about the protective custody decree, which was almost word for word, like the Preventive Detention Act. You understand? So, look, if you begin to examine these matters, there's not enough time on a program like this to examine all the matters and all the issues and so on. But the point is, the fight for reparation is a necessary fight. And when I started reading, and looking for material and so on for my book, I came across something which struck me very deeply. And it was that it had become an argument between Marxists and non-Marxists, between capitalists and socialists and so on, about whether or not we should have reparation. And I said, why are these people arguing about themselves? They are all speaking the same language. You can look at reparation as redistribution of surplus value in Marxist terms. Or you can even just look at reparation as redistribution of value, not surplus value. That's Marxist. Complete Marxist. People rendered labor and benefited zero from their labor. It's a question of redistribution, which is justified under Marxist, philosophy, literature, and so on. Okay? So I thought that it was possible to unite everybody around the concept and need for reparation. That is why I wrote the book. I've been struggling with other books. For 10 years, I have not been able to write and so on. I'm still struggling. Every time I write a few paragraphs and I lose inspiration, I put it down. But when I started writing this book, I never for one moment lost inspiration. Because of the facts and how they impacted on me and so on. I finished it in no time. In months, this book was ready. I've been writing one book for 5 years. It's still lying on my decks. I'm not sufficiently inspired to finish it. But this book, just the information that you come across and the analysis you come across and so on, is so compelling. Look, one of the most significant things that happened at the last summit of African heads in Addis Ababa this month is the commitment of all 55 countries in the world to support President Mahama's initiative to table a resolution at the UN General Assembly which recognizes the transatlantic slave trade as a crime, as the worst crime against humanity. 55 African countries will put their weight behind that resolution. Not just that, there are now efforts for Africa to unite with the Caribbean, for CARICOM to come on board in order to support that resolution. I am confident that next month, some earth-shaking decision will be taken in the UN General Assembly. And that earth-shaking decision will be a decision by CARICOM and the African Union to insist that the transatlantic slave trade is a crime, the worst, not just a crime, but the worst crime of humanity. And that we, the African people, on the continent and the diaspora, will continue this resistance against what they did to us. We will continue to fight until we have established justice. And establishing justice can only mean resetting the world. Resetting the world, restoring the pride and dignity of the African people, restoring the African hope, and so on. And so, let me tell you one thing before I end. This is just for you, my brother. Solo, can I finish? Can I finish? Okay.
So, in all these, at the point I was getting, do we as Africans need monetary consideration for this whole reparation, or we don't need it? Because
we are not asking.
Are we fighting for any financial consideration?
Financial consideration is a term I would never use.
So are we looking up to them to pay us any money?
It is not about them paying us.
Because you see, that is where
they have stolen our resources and we are taking back our resources. So they are not paying us. They are not doing us a favor.
The amputation that people suffered in Congo, what value in terms of monetary consideration are we going to put on it? That people were amputated. The General Matumba that gave you the account, her ordeal. What sort of monetary value would you place on her ordeal? That is very difficult. In terms of
I have told you from the beginning that no amount of money can pay for the atrocities.
Yes.
Listen, that no amount of money can pay for the atrocities. And what we need to do is to reset the world so that these atrocities would never again be visited on any people. That's the point I made. So you should understand it from that point of view. But why? Our wealth which was stolen, we will take it back. We are not asking them to pay us. We are not asking them to do a favor by giving us assistance. We are demanding our wealth. Have you seen the courage, the ceremonial courage of the Queen of England? It's gold, raw gold. Have you seen it? I'm sure all of you have seen the ceremonial courage of the Queen of England. All that gold came from Cape Coast. All that gold, which was used in the construction of that carriage, came from Cape Coast. It doesn't belong to them. One of the most insulting things they do, when we ask for the return of our artifacts and so on, they say, oh, we don't have museums which have reached their standard. And therefore they are worried that when they return these artifacts, we will not be able to look after it well. Nonsense! You know why is this nonsense? You know, some of these artifacts they stole are not meant for museums. They are part of our daily lives. You understand? The remains of the kings of Benin and so on were not meant for museums. They are meant to be kept in our palaces as symbols that link us to our ancestors. They are not museum materials. And they should stop telling us where to keep things that we produce. We produce our own things and you tell us how to keep them. And if we cannot meet your standards, we will not return them. And the most annoying part, when they are compelled to return some of the artifacts, they say they are returning them on loan. Boge, you are returning our own things to us on loan. Boge, well, what is that?
Thank you.
So these things, they are so annoying.
Thank you.
They're so annoying.
Well,